Okay, with permission of the chairs, I will now call the second speaker of the opposition, Hasib Hairul.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's begin with the supposed concession team opposition today made. They claimed we gave in to the need to advance the healthcare system of the United States, when in fact, ladies and gentlemen, the topic for debate today is this House would ban all private healthcare. And that was something that opposition came out today and told you we do not agree to that need. We do not agree to the fact that every single private healthcare institution in the entire United States of America needs to be banned. Now, Team Proposition today came forward and they talked about how the right to choose for the bottom 5% is actually more important than the other 95%. But ladies and gentlemen, first of all, that's a fallacy because the right to life is someone everyone has equally. And if someone rich has enough money to preserve their loved one's life or to preserve their own life, they have just as much right as someone poor to go ahead, to continue with their life, to get the best possible healthcare for themselves. So this lack of resources that side proposition talks about, that goes against fundamental human resources, because fundamental human rights, because you're claiming that someone who has money does not have the right to use that money to save and preserve their own life. Now, moving on to another major issue in this debate, which is the 20 or 30% of uninsured people in America who do not currently have access to adequate health care. Now, proposition believes the correct way to address that is to ban every single private institution all across America. Opposition, on the other hand, believes why not just have state-funded healthcare system for that 20 to 30%? Why not just fund those that absolutely need it? Why take an extreme burden on yourself when it is not needed? When that 70% can still fund themselves, when that 70% still have adequate resources to provide themselves with adequate healthcare, why should the government compromise on its own strength? Yes, sir.
Where will the money come from that?
Well, under your case, it would come from charities, but I'll come back to that later. So let's talk about where that money would come from. Now, we're talking about 20 to 30% as opposed to the 100% of the population that you're shifting onto the government's burden. That 20 to 30% is still a reasonable burden on the government compared to the 100% that type proposition wants the government to take care of. That, ladies and gentlemen, simply is not possible because America might be the biggest economy in the world, but even they can't adequately provide healthcare to 100% of the population, especially when it's a sudden shift. You didn't really provide us a frame of time in which it would happen. You claimed that it would happen all of a sudden. When that happens, your government is suddenly overburdened, and that we believe is unfair on the government and on the taxpayers who will have to uphold this burden, who will have to bear this burden the most. Now, coming on to the second issue, which proposition brought up today. Undue pressure on the doctors. Now, ladies and gentlemen, as we pointed out in PUI, unless under your model doctors are replaced by robots and patient will have no influence on them whatsoever, that undue pressure does not count. Now, coming to the point of pharmaceutical companies, which you also brought up. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let's see how this works. Pharmaceutical companies pressure a certain doctor to go with their brand of drug because at the end of the day, it increases their profit. However, that drug is FDA approved. It is good for the patient regardless of which brand supplies it, and that really does not affect the quality of healthcare which the patient is receiving. And under those circumstances, we believe it is kind of irrelevant to this debate. Yes, sir.
So there are certain people who do not need that medication to begin with. That's why they're over-medicated to increase the sale of this medication. In our system, we'll ban direct access to physicians for these pharmaceutical representatives.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, if you really want to tackle that, set a more stringent prescription system. If you really want to tackle those problems, that is a whole separate debate. However, let's come back to this one. Now, proposition also believes that their policy of taxation is the best way to go forward. Ladies and gentlemen, that is absurd. Because at the end of the day, it is your taxpayers that are going to bear the extra burden of 100% of the population suddenly being dependent on the government to provide them with healthcare. At this moment, it's not that big a deal. However, if your taxpayers have to bear that burden, how is that a successful policy? And that brings me to how they plan on increasing the funds, how they plan on achieving the funds for their model. They will take money from charities, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I'd just like to question how exactly is that state-funded healthcare? And secondly, talking about charities, at this moment, charities do give to hospitals. Charities already try to provide for that 5% who can't really provide for themselves. If they can't meet the needs of that 5% adequately, as you point out, how will they cater to the needs of that 100%, ladies and gentlemen? How exactly will they cater to that need? These charities are not going to suddenly bloom into mountains of money. No, thank you, sir. Now, coming to the point about sustainability, which was something side of proposition today did not even try to touch upon. We gave you the example of the recession, how that is always a possibility where government is involved in the funding, and how that is always going to be a risk to this policy. Now, let's talk. You claim that the government will not compromise any bit whatsoever on their healthcare system. Now, ladies and gentlemen, when a government is hit by recession, it's simply not possible that that recession will not ripple out to all aspects of its economy, will not ripple out to all aspects of its spending. It is actually impossible, economically impossible, that the government will be completely unaffected in the area of healthcare if it is hit by recession. No, thank you, sir. Now, since I've addressed that point and proposition has yet to even tackle it, I'll move on. They claim that we will need to print money in order to sustain our system. We will need to print money in order to provide that money. Well, I've just shown you that in our system, it's only 20 to 30% of the needy population of the United States of America which is reliant on the government. That other 70%, that other 60 to 70% can still cater for themselves, and that is the beauty of our policy. We managed to ensure that everyone has access to adequate healthcare. We managed to ensure that everyone has adequate access to quality healthcare. And at the end of the day, that is what you claim is the responsibility of the government. And if that is being fulfilled, proposition should have no issue with it. No, thank you, sir. Now, lastly, they talked about creating more jobs, ladies and gentlemen. Now, unless you plan to, they talked about creating more jobs. Now, to become a licensed physician, to become a medical practitioner, you need 9, 10 years of specialization, medical school, undergrad, all that stuff. But they claim they will suddenly, all of a sudden, create jobs simply by implementing this policy. Now, what about those 9 years in which there will still be overworked doctors, in which there will still be a lack of doctors? No, thank you, sir. Speaking of lack of doctors, that's actually part of my own positive case, and I'll address that in more detail right now. Now, moving on to my positive case, which is the inefficacy of such a system, the inefficacy of a state-funded healthcare system. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we see there is a state-funded healthcare system in the UK, the NHS. We've seen the long lines those people have to wait for simply to get their backaches checked out. We've seen how many times and how many bureaucratic procedures they have to go through to get a simple checkup. Now, if that is what proposition is proposing today, we do not stand for that, because that is compromising on healthcare. Now, let's look at this in a rational way, ladies and gentlemen. The government will not be able to uphold the entire private healthcare system all by itself. The government simply does not have the funds to simply come in and act as a stopgap. Hence, all those private institutions, some of those private institutions will close down. Some of those private institutions will be unavailable to that public. And that is what leads to lack of doctors, ladies and gentlemen. That is what leads to lack of doctors. Now, would you rather have underpaid, harassed doctors as under the propositions policy, or well-paid, albeit a bit overworked doctors as under ours? The thing is that in our policy, we provide you with adequate care. We provide everyone with an equal opportunity to get that care, and that is why side opposition's policy today caters to everything the proposition has thrown at it. We've shown you that it is not some utopian policy. We've shown you that it caters not just to the rich, it also caters to those that need healthcare the most, and that is why I believe today you should vote for side opposition.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes, 4 seconds.